I'm Emma, 28, and this morning my phone buzzed with 14 missed calls from my family. The same family who chose my sister Rachel over me 3 months ago when she screamed that I'd ruined their perfect lives. The same parents who watched me pack my bags without saying a single word to stop me. Now they're desperate to reach me, but they have no idea what I've discovered about their precious golden child. What I found out changes everything they thought they knew about family loyalty. Before we dive into this wild family revenge story, I'm curious, what do you think finally made my family blow up my phone after months of silence? Drop your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping family drama stories. Trust me, you won't believe the karma that's about to unfold. Growing up in the Henderson household meant living in the shadow of perfection, specifically, Rachel's perfection. My sister was 2 years younger but somehow always seemed to be miles ahead in everything that mattered to our parents. While I struggled through high school with decent B's and C's, Rachel effortlessly maintained a 4.0 GPA. When I joined the school newspaper, she became student body president. When I learned to play guitar, she mastered piano and violin simultaneously. Our parents, David and Margaret Henderson, were classic overachievers themselves. Dad owned a successful accounting firm, and Mom was a real estate agent who consistently ranked in the top 5% of her company. They lived and breathed success stories, and Rachel was their masterpiece while I felt like a rough draft they kept meaning to revise. The dynamic in our house was painfully predictable. Rachel's achievements were celebrated with elaborate dinners, social media posts, and endless bragging to neighbors. My accomplishments were acknowledged with a brief good job before the conversation inevitably shifted back to whatever Rachel was excelling at that week. When Rachel got accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship, they threw a party. When I got accepted to the local state university, they said they were proud but suggested I could have applied myself more like my sister. After college, the pattern continued. Rachel landed a prestigious job at a tech startup in Silicon Valley, complete with stock options and a 6-figure salary. I became a social worker, helping at-risk youth in our hometown. The salary difference was astronomical, but I loved my work. It didn't matter to my parents, they saw Rachel's success as validation of their parenting, while my career choice was treated as a noble but ultimately disappointing detour from real success. Rachel visited home quarterly, always with stories about her glamorous life, expensive vacations, and important colleagues. She'd sweep into town like a celebrity, and our parents would rearrange their schedules entirely around her visits. Meanwhile, I lived 20 minutes away and saw them regularly, but somehow I remained invisible whenever Rachel was in the picture. The golden child treatment extended beyond career success. When Rachel dated, our parents gushed over her boyfriends, even the obviously wrong ones. When I brought someone home, they were polite but distant, never quite good enough for their standards, though they never articulated what those standards actually were. Rachel could do no wrong, I could rarely do anything entirely right. What hurt most wasn't the obvious favoritism, it was the gaslighting that came with it. Whenever I tried to address the imbalance, they'd dismiss my concerns with phrases like "you're being too sensitive" or "we treat you girls exactly the same." They'd point to material things they'd bought me as evidence of equal treatment, completely missing the emotional disparity that had shaped our entire family dynamic. I learned to cope by building my own life, finding validation in my work and friendships outside the family bubble. I thought I'd made peace with being the overlooked daughter until everything exploded 3 months ago. That's when Rachel's carefully constructed perfect life started showing cracks, and instead of supporting both daughters equally, my parents made a choice that shattered what little relationship we had left. The irony wasn't lost on me that after years of feeling invisible, I was about to become the center of attention in ways none of us could have predicted. Sometimes the family scapegoat becomes the one who exposes everyone else's carefully hidden truths. The beginning of the end started on a rainy Tuesday in March when Rachel showed up at our parents' house unannounced. I happened to be there for our monthly family dinner, a tradition I'd maintained despite feeling like an afterthought at my own family table. Rachel looked different that night, disheveled, exhausted, and lacking her usual polished confidence. She'd driven 6 hours from California without warning, claiming she needed a break from her high-stress job. Our parents immediately went into protective mode, fussing over her like she was a wounded bird. They canceled their evening plans, ordered her favorite takeout, and created an impromptu welcome home celebration. I watched from the sidelines, familiar with this drill but still stung by how effortlessly she commanded their attention. Over the next few days, details began emerging about Rachel's break. Her startup was struggling, she'd been laid off, and her relationship with her long-term boyfriend had imploded. She'd also accumulated significant debt trying to maintain her Silicon Valley lifestyle on credit cards and loans. The golden child was tarnished, but instead of treating this as a normal life setback, our parents treated it like a national emergency. They immediately offered her my old bedroom, started researching job opportunities for her, and began subsidizing her lifestyle without question. Dad quietly transferred money to her accounts, and Mom started making calls to her professional network on Rachel's behalf. The princess was back in her castle, and everyone was working overtime to restore her crown. What broke me wasn't their willingness to help Rachel, it was their complete inability to see how their response affected me. During this same period, I was dealing with my own challenges. The nonprofit where I worked was facing budget cuts, and I was likely to lose my job. I'd mentioned this to them several times, but it barely registered compared to Rachel's crisis. When I tried to have a conversation with them about potentially needing financial support myself, the response was dramatically different. They suggested I look into government assistance programs, recommended I consider a career change to something more stable, and implied that my job loss was somehow preventable if I'd made better choices. The double standard was breathtaking. The final straw came during what was supposed to be a family dinner to support each other through difficult times. Rachel had been home for 3 weeks, and the entire household revolved around her needs and moods. That evening, she was particularly volatile, stressed about a job interview that hadn't gone well. When I mentioned that I'd been officially laid off and was struggling to make rent, Rachel exploded. She screamed that I was being selfish, trying to steal attention from her real problems, and that I'd always been jealous of her success. She accused me of deliberately timing my bad news to overshadow her struggles and claimed I was manipulative and attention-seeking. The words were devastating, but what happened next destroyed something fundamental in our family dynamic. Instead of defending me or asking Rachel to tone down her attack, our parents sided with her completely. Dad told me I was adding unnecessary stress to an already difficult situation. Mom said I needed to be more supportive of my sister during her crisis and suggested my timing was inconsiderate. They essentially told me that my pain was less valid than Rachel's, my struggles were less important than hers, and my need for support was secondary to maintaining her emotional stability. 28 years of being the second-choice daughter crystallized in that moment into absolute clarity: I would never be their priority. Rachel continued her tirade, calling me selfish, manipulative, and a burden on the family. She said I'd always tried to ruin her achievements with my drama and that she was sick of my jealousy. She climaxed by screaming that I had ruined their lives by always being the difficult child who needed attention. Our parents didn't interrupt her, didn't defend me, didn't even ask her to lower her voice. They sat there and let her eviscerate me, then nodded along when she finished, as if her assessment was reasonable and justified. That night, I went home and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight for scraps of affection anymore. I wasn't going to beg to be valued in a family that had already decided my worth. I was done. The next morning, I woke up with unusual clarity. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't going to try to fix things with my family. I wasn't going to apologize for existing or explain why I deserved basic consideration. Instead, I was going to disappear from their lives as completely as they'd always wished I would. I started methodically. First, I blocked their numbers on my phone and social media accounts. I didn't want angry calls or guilt-tripping messages disrupting my mental space. Then I began the practical work of cutting ties. I removed myself from family group chats, canceled shared streaming services, and returned anything I'd borrowed over the years. The hardest part was deciding how much to explain. Part of me wanted to write a detailed letter outlining years of hurt and disappointment, but I realized that would just give them ammunition to dismiss my feelings as dramatic or oversensitive. Instead, I sent one simple text before blocking them. I'm removing myself from this family dynamic. Don't contact me. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with calls from numbers I'd blocked, but I felt surprisingly peaceful. I'd spent decades trying to earn love that was always conditional, and I was finally free from that exhausting cycle. I threw myself into rebuilding my life independently. Despite losing my job, I had savings and immediately started applying for positions in other cities. I'd always stayed local partly to maintain family connections, but now that anchor was cut, I could go anywhere, be anyone, start fresh without the weight of their expectations or disappointment. The job search revealed something interesting. My experience in social work, combined with my education, made me highly marketable in several major cities. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 promising interviews lined up in different states. For the first time in years, I felt excited about my future instead of trapped by family obligations. I also started therapy, something I'd considered for years but never prioritized. Dr. Sarah Chen helped me understand the psychological impact of growing up as the family scapegoat. She explained how constant comparison and conditional love had shaped my self-worth and relationships. More importantly, she validated what I'd always suspected. The family dynamic I'd experienced wasn't normal or healthy. Through our sessions, I began to see patterns I'd never noticed. Rachel's behavior wasn't just favoritism, it was actively encouraged narcissism. Our parents had created a family system where one child could do no wrong while the other could never do enough right. This wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate choice that served their own needs to have a successful child they could showcase. Meanwhile, my absence was apparently creating waves at home. Through mutual friends, I heard that my parents were initially dismissive of my dramatic exit, assuming I'd come crawling back within a few days. When I didn't, they started asking neighbors and family friends if they'd heard from me. Rachel, still living in my childhood bedroom, was reportedly telling everyone I was having a mental health crisis and needed professional help. Their narrative about my disappearance was predictably self-serving. I wasn't a daughter who'd been pushed to her breaking point, I was an unstable person who'd abandoned her family during a crisis. They positioned themselves as victims of my inexplicable cruelty, completely rewriting the history of what had actually happened. But something else was happening that they didn't expect. Extended family members and family friends started asking questions. When people inquired about me, my parents' explanations didn't quite add up. Why would the daughter who'd always been responsible and caring suddenly abandon her family? Why had no one heard from me, and why were my parents being so vague about the circumstances? Some people started connecting dots. They remembered years of family gatherings where I'd been overlooked or dismissed. They recalled conversations where my achievements were barely mentioned while Rachel's were celebrated extensively. A few family friends reached out to mutual acquaintances, trying to get my side of the story. I maintained my silence, which frustrated my parents but spoke volumes to people who knew me. The Emma they knew wasn't dramatic or attention-seeking. If I'd cut contact this completely, there had to be a serious reason. 6 weeks after my departure, I accepted a position as a program coordinator for a youth advocacy organization in Denver. The salary was 20% higher than my previous job, the benefits were excellent, and the work aligned perfectly with my passions. I gave my landlord notice, hired movers, and prepared to start over in a city where no one knew my family history. The night before I left town, I allowed myself one moment of sadness for what could have been. I wasn't just moving away from my hometown, I was closing the door on any hope of having the family relationships I'd always wanted. But that sadness was mixed with overwhelming relief. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based entirely on what was best for me, not what would minimize family conflict or earn their approval. I had no idea that my strategic disappearance was just the beginning of a much larger unraveling that would expose secrets none of us had seen coming. 2 months into my new life in Denver, I was thriving in ways I hadn't expected. My job was challenging and fulfilling, I'd made friends who valued my perspective, and I was discovering parts of my personality that had been suppressed for years. Without constantly walking on eggshells around my family's dynamics, I was more confident, more decisive, and genuinely happy. Then I got an unexpected call that changed everything. My college friend Jessica, who still lived in my hometown, called with news that made my blood run cold. She'd been having drinks with her cousin Mark, who worked in tech security, when my family's situation came up in conversation. Mark mentioned he'd been hired to do some digital forensics work for a local accounting firm, my father's firm. According to Mark, Dad's business partner had discovered irregularities in client accounts and suspected embezzlement. They'd brought in Mark to trace digital transactions and recover deleted files. What he found was explosive. Someone had been systematically stealing from client accounts for over 2 years, moving small amounts that wouldn't be immediately noticed but added up to nearly $400,000 in total theft. The sophisticated nature of the theft suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the firm's systems and client information. Mark's investigation revealed that the thefts coincided precisely with Rachel's financial struggles. Starting around the time her startup began failing and her lifestyle became unsustainable. But there was more. Mark had found deleted text messages between Rachel and Dad, discussing temporary borrowing from client accounts and promises to pay everything back once she got back on her feet. Dad hadn't just been transferring his own money to support Rachel, he'd been stealing from his clients to fund her lifestyle. The scheme was beginning to unravel because several clients were preparing for tax season and requesting detailed account statements. The missing money couldn't be hidden much longer, and Dad's business partner was threatening to involve law enforcement if the stolen funds weren't returned immediately. Jessica's call left me reeling. The golden child who'd accused me of ruining the family had literally committed crimes that could destroy our father's career and send both of them to prison. The parents who'd chosen her over me had been funding her privileged lifestyle with stolen money while lecturing me about making better choices. But I felt something else alongside the shock, a cold satisfaction that the truth was finally surfacing. For years, I'd been gaslit into believing I was the problem, the difficult daughter who couldn't appreciate her successful sister. Now I understood that Rachel's success had been purchased with other people's money, and my parents had been complicit in criminal activity. I spent the next week processing this information. Part of me wanted to immediately call the police or Dad's clients, but a larger part wanted to see how this played out naturally. I'd been accused of being manipulative and attention-seeking. Now I could watch actual manipulation and fraud destroy itself without my involvement. The irony was perfect. Rachel had screamed that I'd ruined their lives, but she was the one who'd committed felonies that could genuinely destroy everything. I'd been painted as jealous of her achievements, but those achievements had been built on a foundation of crime and deception. 2 weeks later, Jessica called with another update. Dad's business partner had issued an ultimatum: return all stolen funds within 72 hours or face criminal charges. The firm's insurance wouldn't cover embezzlement by a partner, meaning Dad would be personally liable for the full amount plus legal fees and penalties. My parents had apparently taken out a second mortgage on their house and were desperately trying to liquidate assets to cover the theft. Rachel's car, a luxury vehicle she'd bought during her successful period, had been repossessed when they couldn't make the payments. They were facing financial ruin, and word was spreading through their social circle about the scandal. This was when the phone calls started. I'd maintained my blocked contact list, but they began trying to reach me through work numbers, mutual friends, and even social media platforms I rarely checked. The messages were initially vague: family emergency, need to talk urgently, please call home immediately. When indirect methods failed, they started having other people contact me. Aunts, uncles, family friends, and even former neighbors were recruited to track me down and convince me to call home. The narrative they were spreading was that Rachel was having a mental health crisis and the family needed to come together to support her through this difficult time. I realized they still didn't know that I knew about the embezzlement. They thought they could manipulate me into returning home to provide emotional support during their crisis, just as they'd expected me to do countless times before. They wanted me to be their family therapist, their peacemaker, their emotional labor provider, while remaining completely in the dark about the criminal activity that had caused their situation. The calls became more desperate. Voicemails from mom talking about forgiveness and family loyalty. Messages from dad about responsibility to each other and not abandoning family during hard times. Even Rachel left teary voicemails about being sorry for harsh words and needing her sister's support and understanding. But I noticed what was missing from all these messages. No one was taking responsibility for the original conflict that drove me away. No one was acknowledging their behavior during that final family dinner. No one was apologizing for choosing Rachel over me or dismissing my struggles. They wanted me to return and provide comfort without addressing any of the issues that had caused my departure. Their crisis had made me valuable to them again, but only as a resource to help them through difficulties they'd created themselves. They still didn't see me as an equal family member deserving respect and consideration. I was just a potential source of support they wanted to exploit during their emergency. Standing in my Denver apartment, looking at my phone lighting up with yet another desperate call, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in our relationship, I had all the power. They needed me more than I needed them, and I finally understood the full scope of their betrayal. But the story was far from over. I had information that could change everything, and decisions to make about whether to stay silent or reveal what I knew. The family that had always underestimated me was about to learn exactly how much damage the difficult daughter could do when she finally decided to fight back. The 14th missed call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. I was getting ready for work when my phone buzzed with Dad's number, the same number I'd blocked months ago, somehow still getting through. I didn't answer, but something about the timing felt different. More desperate. More final. That evening, I decided to do some research of my own. If my family was going to keep harassing me, I wanted to understand exactly what they were facing. I started with public records, searching for any legal filings involving Dad's firm. What I found exceeded even my expectations. The embezzlement had been reported to authorities. Dad's business partner had made good on his threat, and criminal charges were pending. But it was worse than Jessica had initially told me. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of financial misconduct spanning 3 years, not 2. The total amount was closer to $600,000, and the FBI was involved because some of the stolen funds had crossed state lines. Rachel wasn't just complicit, she was likely to face federal charges as an accessory to fraud. The temporary borrowing defense wouldn't hold up in court, especially with documented evidence of her knowledge and participation. Dad was looking at serious prison time, and the accounting license he'd spent decades building was gone forever. But the legal troubles were just the beginning. Their social standing was evaporating as news spread through their community. Dad's clients were filing civil lawsuits to recover their losses. The mortgage on their house was in default. Rachel had moved back in with them not because she was taking a break from her successful career, but because she literally had nowhere else to go. I realized why the phone calls had become so frantic. They weren't just dealing with legal and financial problems. They were facing complete social and economic collapse. The perfect family image they'd cultivated for decades was crumbling publicly, and I was the only family member who could potentially provide support without being criminally implicated. But they still didn't know that I knew. This gave me options I'd never had before. I could maintain my silence and let the consequences unfold naturally. I could reveal my knowledge and use it as leverage. Or I could choose mercy and offer support despite their betrayal. For the first time in our family relationship, I was in complete control. I thought about Rachel's words during our last confrontation. "You've always tried to ruin her achievements with your drama." The irony was staggering. Her achievements had been purchased with stolen money, and her drama was destroying everything our parents had worked to build. I hadn't ruined anything. I'd simply removed myself from a toxic situation that was always going to implode eventually. The calls kept coming, but now I listened to some of the voicemails. The messages revealed escalating desperation and a complete inability to understand why their manipulation wasn't working. They still thought they could guilt me into returning by emphasizing family loyalty and moral obligation, without ever acknowledging their own failures or crimes. Mom's messages were particularly revealing. She talked about difficult times and family sticking together while carefully avoiding any specifics about what those difficult times actually involved. She spoke about Rachel's struggles and need for understanding without mentioning that those struggles included federal crime investigation. Dad's voicemails focused on responsibility and duty. He talked about mature family members stepping up during crises and implied that my absence was somehow selfish and childish. The man who'd embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars was lecturing me about moral responsibility. Rachel's messages were the most manipulative. She alternated between fake apologies and emotional manipulation, claiming she'd learned so much about herself and really needed her big sister's wisdom and support. She talked about being grateful for family and wanting to repair their relationship without acknowledging any specific wrongdoing or taking concrete responsibility for her behavior. None of them seemed to grasp that I might have my own life now, my own priorities, my own needs that didn't revolve around their crisis management. They still saw me as a supporting character in their story, someone whose primary function was to provide emotional labor when they needed it. But something was shifting in their approach. The latest messages carried a new tone of genuine fear. They were starting to realize that their usual manipulation tactics weren't working, and my continued absence was becoming a real problem for them. Without me as their family mediator and emotional caretaker, they had no buffer for their conflicts and no one to provide unconditional support during their crisis. I began to understand the full extent of my role in their family system. I hadn't just been the overlooked daughter, I'd been their emotional shock absorber, the person who smoothed over conflicts and provided stability when things got difficult. My absence was forcing them to confront their dysfunction without their usual safety net. They were also discovering that their community support was conditional. Fair-weather friends were distancing themselves from the scandal. Professional networks were closing ranks against Dad's reputation damage. Rachel's social media perfect lifestyle had been built on superficial connections that evaporated when her circumstances changed. For decades, they'd taken my loyalty for granted while investing their emotional energy in relationships and achievements that turned out to be fragile. Now they were learning the difference between unconditional family support and the conditional approval they'd always prioritized. I made a decision that night. I wasn't going to respond to their calls or messages, but I wasn't going to block them either. I wanted to see how far their desperation would escalate when they realized their manipulation had completely failed. I was curious about what they'd do when they finally understood that I wasn't coming back to rescue them from consequences they'd created themselves. The girl who'd spent her life trying to earn their love was gone. In her place was a woman who understood her own worth and wasn't willing to accept crumbs from people who'd never valued her properly. They were about to learn what it felt like to need someone who no longer needed them back. 3 days after ignoring their 14th call, I received a message that changed the entire game. It wasn't from my parents or Rachel, it was from Agent Patricia Williams of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Agent Williams explained that my family had provided my contact information as part of their cooperation agreement with federal investigators. They were claiming I might have information relevant to the embezzlement case, specifically about Rachel's financial circumstances and any conversations I might have witnessed about borrowing money or financial stress. The message was professional but clear: they wanted to interview me as a potential witness. My family had thrown me under the bus as part of their legal strategy, hoping to demonstrate their cooperation while potentially implicating me in their crimes. After months of desperately trying to get me to call them back, they'd given federal agents my information without warning. I called Agent Williams immediately and scheduled an interview for the following week. During our conversation, I learned that my parents and Rachel were trying to minimize their culpability by suggesting the family had been dealing with financial stress that affected everyone's judgment. They were painting a picture of collective family hardship rather than deliberate criminal activity. But they'd made a critical mistake. By involving me in their federal investigation, they'd given me official standing to share everything I knew, including information they didn't realize I possessed. The interview with Agent Williams was enlightening for both of us. I explained my family dynamic, the circumstances of my departure, and my complete lack of knowledge about any financial crimes during the time I lived locally. But I also shared what Jessica had told me about the timeline of thefts, the digital forensics findings, and the text messages between Rachel and Dad discussing temporary borrowing. Agent Williams was particularly interested in my perspective on Rachel's lifestyle and spending patterns. I described her expensive cars, designer clothes, frequent vacations, and lavish social media presence, all during a period when she was supposedly struggling financially after losing her job. The contrast between her public image and her actual circumstances provided crucial context for prosecutors building their case. More importantly, my testimony contradicted the narrative my family was trying to construct. I wasn't a family member who'd been aware of financial stress and potentially complicit in poor decisions. I was a witness to their deception who'd been deliberately excluded from their criminal conspiracy, then scapegoated when their lies became unsustainable. After the interview, Agent Williams told me something that crystallized everything. Your family's biggest mistake was making you their enemy instead of keeping you close. If they'd maintained a relationship with you, you might have been willing to provide character testimony or emotional support. Instead, you're now a credible witness who can testify to their patterns of deception and manipulation. She was right. If they'd treated me fairly, if they'd acknowledged my worth, if they'd supported me during my own struggles, I might have been willing to help them through this crisis despite their crimes. Instead, their years of dismissal and the final betrayal had eliminated any loyalty I might have felt. I left the FBI office feeling something I'd never experienced in relation to my family, complete clarity about who held the moral high ground. For years, they'd made me question my perceptions and doubt my worth. Now federal investigators were validating what I'd always known, that their behavior was fundamentally wrong, not just toward me but toward everyone they'd stolen from. The next day, my phone exploded with panicked messages. They'd apparently learned about my FBI interview and were terrified about what I might have said. The messages revealed their true priorities. Not remorse for their crimes, not concern for their victims, but fear that I might have damaged their legal strategy. Mom's voicemail was particularly telling. Emma, we hope you didn't say anything that might hurt the family. We're already going through so much, and we need to stick together now more than ever. Please call us back so we can explain everything. She still thought she could manage me, control the narrative, and minimize the consequences of their choices. She wanted to explain everything not because they felt I deserved the truth, but because they were afraid of what I might do with the truth I already possessed. Dad's message was more direct. Your interview with the FBI could have serious consequences for this family. We need to know what you told them so we can coordinate our responses. This isn't the time for personal grievances, we need to focus on protecting everyone. Even facing federal prison, he was still trying to command my loyalty and cooperation without offering anything in return. He wanted me to subordinate my integrity to their legal strategy, to lie or omit information to protect people who'd never protected me. Rachel's voicemail was pure manipulation. Emma, I know we've had our differences, but I'm scared. I made mistakes, but I never meant for things to get this bad. Please don't let them destroy our whole family over this. You're the only one who can help us now. She was finally acknowledging mistakes, but only in the context of asking me to fix the consequences. She wanted me to believe that testifying honestly would make me responsible for destroying our family, rather than holding her accountable for the crimes that had actually destroyed it. I realized that even in crisis, they couldn't break their fundamental pattern. Expecting me to sacrifice my well-being for theirs, to prioritize their needs over basic ethics, to provide unconditional support while receiving none in return. But this time was different. This time, I had external validation of their wrongdoing. This time, I had legal and moral authority supporting my position. This time, I didn't have to choose between my integrity and my family's approval, because I'd already lost their approval and discovered I could live without it. I made one final decision about our relationship. I recorded a single voicemail and sent it to all three of their numbers simultaneously. I've received your messages about the FBI interview. I told them the complete truth about our family dynamics and everything I knew about your financial situation. I will continue to cooperate fully with their investigation because it's the right thing to do. The same people who taught me about moral responsibility should understand why I can't help you avoid the consequences of criminal activity. Don't contact me again. Then I blocked their numbers permanently. The family that had never valued my voice would never hear it again. 6 months later, I was reading the Denver Post over morning coffee when I saw the headline, "Local Accountant Sentenced to 4 years in Federal Prison for Embezzlement." Below it was a photo of my father in a suit, looking older and smaller than I remembered, being led into the courthouse. The article detailed the full scope of their crimes. Dad received 4 years in federal prison plus restitution requirements that would financially devastate him for decades. Rachel was sentenced to 18 months and 3 years of supervised probation. Their restitution obligations totaled over $800,000 when damages and penalties were included. But the criminal penalties were just the beginning of their consequences. Dad's accounting license was permanently revoked. Their house had been foreclosed to pay victim compensation. Rachel's college alumni network had quietly distanced itself from her, making employment in her field nearly impossible. The social standing they'd built over decades was permanently destroyed. According to the article, several clients had provided victim impact statements describing how the theft had affected their retirement savings, business operations, and trust in professional services. These weren't abstract financial crimes, they were betrayals that had damaged real people's lives and futures. I felt a complex mix of emotions reading about their sentences. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also sadness for what our family could have been if they'd made different choices. Most surprisingly, I felt grateful. Their betrayal had forced me to discover my own strength and build a life based on authentic relationships rather than conditional approval. My life in Denver had exceeded every expectation. My work with at-risk youth was recognized with a state award for program innovation. I'd been promoted twice and was now managing a team of advocates across 3 cities. I'd also met someone, David, a teacher whose kindness and emotional intelligence reminded me daily what healthy relationships looked like. The friends I'd made valued my perspective, celebrated my achievements, and supported me through challenges without keeping score or making comparisons. I'd discovered what family should feel like by creating it with people who chose to love me unconditionally. About a month after the sentencing, I received a letter in the mail. The return address was a federal correctional facility, and the handwriting was Dad's. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. The letter was 3 pages of self-pity disguised as remorse. Dad wrote about how difficult prison was, how the family had been destroyed by the investigation, and how much they all missed me. He claimed to have learned from his mistakes and hoped we could rebuild our relationship when he was released. But nowhere in those 3 pages did he take genuine responsibility for the choices that had led to his imprisonment. Nowhere did he acknowledge how his favoritism and financial crimes had affected other people. Most tellingly, nowhere did he apologize for the specific behaviors that had driven me away in the first place. He was still trying to manage me, still hoping to reconstruct our family dynamic with himself at the center and me providing unconditional forgiveness and support. Even from prison, he couldn't imagine a world where I might have moved on and built something better without them. I wrote back a single sentence: "I hope you use your time in prison to develop genuine insight into how your choices affected other people." Then I threw away his address and moved on with my life. 2 years have passed since then. I've been promoted again and am now the regional director overseeing youth advocacy programs across 4 states. David and I are planning our wedding, and I've built relationships with his family that show me what unconditional love actually looks like. Sometimes people ask if I regret cutting contact with my family or if I plan to reconcile with them eventually. The answer is complicated but ultimately clear. I don't regret choosing my own well-being over their dysfunction, and I have no plans to rebuild relationships with people who showed me exactly who they were when it mattered most. The family that once made me feel invisible taught me the most valuable lesson of my life: That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to love you properly. Their betrayal became my liberation, their crisis became my clarity, and their downfall became my opportunity to rise. I learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about respect, support, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The people who truly love you don't make you compete for their affection or conditional their support on your usefulness to them. They don't steal from others to fund their lifestyle, then expect you to provide emotional labor to help them avoid consequences. Sometimes karma doesn't just catch up with people, it runs them down completely. My parents and Rachel spent years teaching me that I wasn't worth their time, attention, or respect. In return, life taught them what it felt like to desperately need someone who was no longer available to them. They wanted the perfect family image without doing the work of being a loving family. They got federal prison sentences and permanent reputational damage instead. They wanted unconditional support without providing unconditional love. They got complete isolation from the one family member who might have actually helped them if they'd ever treated her as an equal. The most beautiful part of this story isn't their downfall, it's discovering that I never needed their approval to build an extraordinary life. The daughter they overlooked became the woman who had the strength to walk away when walking away was the healthiest choice. The family scapegoat became the only family member with integrity intact. Final call to action. What do you think? Was I right to cooperate with the FBI investigation, or should family loyalty have come first regardless of their crimes? Have you ever had to choose between your own well-being and toxic family relationships? How far would you go to protect yourself from people who claim to love you but consistently treat you poorly? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. It helps other people find these real-life family drama stories. Don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales of family dysfunction, workplace revenge, and karma coming full circle. Share this video with anyone who's ever felt like the family scapegoat or struggled with toxic family dynamics. Sometimes we need to hear other people's stories to validate our own experiences and find the courage to make difficult but necessary changes. Thank you for listening to my story and for all your support. I hope my experience reminds you that you deserve relationships that lift you up rather than tear you down, and that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to accept less than your worth. Remember, you can't control how other people treat you, but you can always control how long you allow it to continue. Choose yourself, choose your peace, and choose relationships that honor the person you truly are. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep fighting for the respect you deserve.